But Deanne Stillman is doing her research on Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, and that has resulted in this new book, which we're talking about. In fact, I think it's fair. Let's go ahead and I think we know enough about the background, and she's been very kind to sort of explain things to us. So let's go ahead and move the needle forward to why it is in American Confidential that she has uncovered not just the bizarre story of Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother, but how that could ever be linked to a word that we use fairly specifically and often, conspiracy. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Deanne Stillman, author of 29 Palms, Desert Reckoning, a cool book about horses called Mustang, horses that live in the desert, and this new book, and that's what we've been talking about here on Coast to Coast, American Confidential, uncovering the bizarre story of Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. It just came out. I think it's let's talk about the boldness of the use of the word conspiracy, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, it's a good question. When I say that together Lee and his mother Marguerite formed a conspiracy, I don't mean that they sat down and planned the assassination of JFK.
Right.
Yeah, I'm saying that together they operated as a unit, strange though it may have been, and at some point this thing that they formed went out of control. It totally jumped the track, and the roots of it were the fact that it goes back to Marguerite's feelings of inferiority, and that she counted for nothing, and that she and her family were nobodies. We're nobody, and if only we knew if only I could marry a rich guy, this would all change. If I could meet somebody important, this would all change. People, in the scheme of things, we're nobodies, and that's the thing that Huey Long was preaching, and she passed all of that on to Lee. And, as much as she might have admired the royals, in her heart, she felt that she counted for nothing. And I think that fueled Lee's own acting out, because his behavior served only to draw attention to himself and make him appear to be important. He was self-centered, and her constant making excuses for him confirmed, at least to the world, that he must have counted for something. Otherwise, why would she keep making excuses for him? This is his view I'm talking about.
Right.
But in private, she berated him. She withheld affection. It was like this love-hate thing. She withheld affection. He was worthless. He was always messing up. And the other sons felt the same way, that there was nothing they could do to win her affection. She was evidently very withholding. So in Lee's case, at some point he jumped the track, as we've talked about, in a very serious way. And I think that when he got back from Russia and when he had his Russian wife and so on, and even that, he was expecting to, for instance, to have been greeted by a mob of reporters when he returned to Texas from Moscow, and nobody was there to greet him except his brother. And so that didn't work out. That didn't make him famous or attract any attention. And, it didn't really matter that much to his mother. I mean, it was like, okay, but your wife doesn't speak English. There was always something wrong.
She was a constant fault finder, and she was what might be described psychologically as an emotional blackmailer.
That's exactly right. She was, very manipulative. Remember the movie The Grifters with Angelica Houston and John Cusack?
Right. Yeah.
They were a lot like that. not that they were operating together, running cons, although she was kind of a con woman herself, and even evidently at work, where she injured her ankle when she was working at a department store in Fort Worth. She said that she broke her ankle and made Lee come home from the Marines that would take a leave and come home and take care of her. Or no, it was Robert. And then,
right.
But at one point he saw her walking around the apartment as if nothing had happened. So
right.
extremely manipulative.
And so I think when we're talking about a conspiracy here, and I was willing to go with you in its more figurative sense, what you're saying is sort of an emotional conspiracy that from some age of in his teenage years and beyond, he was trying to impress his mother, and she was always goading him on to do something or to be something, and
that's
that
right.
she,
if only, the world is your oyster, son. If you could do something grand and attract
right.
a lot of attention to yourself, everything would be different.
So
she was a woman very driven by external by how things looked.
right.
She didn't have any feelings of her own self-worth, so she was always worried about how things looked.
I'm not sure, just FYI, exactly, I'm picking up this sort of weird sound from your microphone. I don't know whether you're moving something around or how that's working, but
is this better? No, I didn't move. Is this better, Ian?
Yeah, way better. Thank you.
Okay.
But I'll let you know. It just seems, for some reason, it just seems like we're getting a sort of a sound of something dragging. So, all right. So let's go ahead and look at, and unpack that, though, because that in itself, I mean, this is to the extreme, and I think every biographer of Lee Harvey Oswald has spent some time talking about, his crummy mother and his bad upbringing, and the fact that he may have been trying to impress somebody. Do you think he was trying to impress his mom with specifically his mother, or to get his mother's attention in all of the different things that he was known to have done, criminal and non-criminal, before he runs off to Russia and then comes back?
Yes, I think it was all about, hey, look, Ma, I just tried to, I almost killed General Walker. I mean,
right.
Even though it wasn't known at the time, but yes, and by extension, it's look, world. Hey, look, world. I mean, look what I did now. But really, it goes back to his mother. Something I say in my book is that he was kind of the original Travis Bickle, and the famous. We all know the famous Polaroid of him standing with his rifle in his backyard in Dallas. The picture that Marina, his wife, took. I feel that in a way that was like the first selfie of a man with a gun, even though it wasn't a selfie. As I said, it was a Polaroid, but it's kind of served that purpose. And it was Oswald showing off there. Look, Ma, I'm armed now. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
You're gonna hear me soon.
Right. And that whole thing with the news, holding up a newspaper, and I mean, this seemed like very pointed behavior of sort of marking his time as important. So
I agree. Yeah,
history would have something to go on. Historians wouldn't have to go digging to get the facts of what led up to whatever his involvement was in Dallas.
Well, right, and I think I think it's telling that he was working at the Texas Book Depository when he shot JFK, because the books that he was packing up there for his job, those were history books for elementary schools. So I think, here's a guy who wanted to go down in history and make his mark.
Right.
And the JFK thing didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, Marguerite, his mother, had sent him a copy of Time magazine with JFK on the cover when he was living in Russia. And clearly, she thought that was important. and he kept it with him, and it was on his coffee table in Dallas, or maybe Fort Worth when he got back. Somebody who had served, an American who had served as who had helped Marina with her English and served as a translator, and befriended the Oswalds through the Russian expatriate community, noted the copy of Time magazine on their coffee table.
Yeah, which is so interesting.
I think he was fixed. JFK was an American king,
right?
And I think the idea of taking down a king, that was a big deal. Obviously, whatever you think of JFK, it was an earth-shattering act. But
yeah, I think that whole reference to Camelot in particular, and that, and if he. Politics be damned. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald's politics were very confused, and we know that he was associated with both left-wing and right-wing groups in these extreme ways, which brings us back to the Kingfish, brings us back to Huey Long, which is, as a populist, he just kind of went with whatever it was that he thought would make him popular.
That's right. Whatever he was doing obviously drew a lot of attention to himself. He was always the center of attention. I mean, whether he was leafleting on the streets in New Orleans or, going to meetings of the Young Socialist Club in New Orleans, whatever it was, he made a point of drawing attention to himself.
He was a fame addict, and
he was a fame addict. That's a good way to put it.
I know a lot of people who are fame addicts. It's very weird, but they.
It is weird, but now that you put it like that, it's very American too.
When I remember the first time when I went to go get my PhD, I was in school with a guy who was a former. A well-known editor-in-chief of a series of newspapers, and he had to retire. And he was there at the school. We were having breakfast that morning, and he said, "How does it feel to be an FFP?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He was formerly famous person, and I'm like, "Oh, I could care less." He goes, "Yeah, and then you're going to do fine." But there are plenty of people who, as soon as they aren't famous, in one sense, at any level, or trying to be famous, they don't know who they are, and they get disoriented, and they have to they draw themselves back to a place where they become something that people talk about. They want to be good or bad. They want to be the person that people are talking about, because that's what they do in their life. They seek out people to talk about, and they obsess over them, and it never satisfies. Like even as you were talking about Marguerite, that his mother might have dreamed of kind of always winning the lottery as a way of solving their problems, but you just get the feeling that if she won $100,000 in the lottery, her next question is, "But I've only won it once," or "Am I expected to get by on $100,000?" Or "How come this other person got?"
That's right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that seems to be the kind of person she was.
Oh, she was. It would be like, well, I lost $98,000 of in taxes, so it's back to square one.
Right. To the government.
Nothing would have ever been enough for her, and she definitely passed on this hollowness to Lee and this craving external approval. And she herself was kind of constantly acting out, and there was a lot of drama around her. She was a kind of a histrionic person, histrionic and very needy. And, Lee, like mother, like son there. I mean, he himself, when he got back from Russia, he had a series of menial jobs, and he couldn't really take care of Marina, his wife, properly, and there was a lot of trouble in their marriage, and as their marriage was spiraling ever downward, I think that kind of fueled his need to do something really big and to make himself important, on the world stage.
Whatever involvement we're talking about for the assassination. So he could easily, just in the kind of profile that you've built, he could have been part of an organization. He could have acted alone. He could have been, he could have been manipulated into doing something. All of these are parts of the profile that fit at the end.
No, I agree with that. I agree. I think he for however the assassination came together, I happen to think that he pulled the trigger. Whether or not some other people joined in, with this new information that's come out from the former Secret Service agent, I don't really know, but it's pretty clear that he was obsessed. Regardless of what other people have said, he had a thing for JFK. Like I said, he had that Time magazine on his coffee table. JFK was an American king. He told Marina, his wife, at one point that he was hoping to have a son someday because maybe the son could grow up and be president. So it's something that he lusted after. He yearned for it. He wanted it. It was, in a way, a quintessential American dream that for him had been thwarted at every level. And so, I think ultimately we could say it was kind of a suicide by presidential assassination.
Right. That's an interesting way of looking at it. All right, so let's pause there. Deanne Stillman doing her research on Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother describing their circular relationship as kind of a conspiracy of sorts, where he was always trying to one-up more of what she was demanding of the world, trying to get her attention at the same time. I got two questions for her that have yet to be answered. And one of those would pertain to his how she acted after his assassination. Do you know this story? It's fascinating. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. The whole mother thing, that can be very compelling. That can inspire people to do good things. It can inspire people to do bad things. They could have a bad mother and they'd want to do something noble. They could have a noble mother and they could end up being an evil seed. There's no real way to predict how somebody will respond. But Deanne Stillman's point is that between Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother, there was a kind of a symbiosis. And it's not unfair, she says, to claim that it's a kind of a conspiracy. Maybe one that we're using in a looser sense of the word, but in pursuit of fame and wanting to become recognized, Lee Harvey Oswald was inspired as much by getting the attention of his mother than he was for any other reason. So she says. And we'll take your calls on that coming up next hour on Coast to Coast. But I want her to explain, with regard to Lee Harvey Oswald's mom, about how it was that she behaved after his death. What did she do? Here he was publicly assassinated himself by Jack Ruby. So how did she respond? That may be the most telling of them all. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. So if you missed it in the first hour, go back and listen to it on YouTube if you'd like, or you can always become a Coast Insider and listen at any time. But in the first hour, we made the sad announcement that I'd also posted earlier on Twitter. At Deacon Punnett is my handle there, that Jason the horse has died. A frequent guest on Coast to Coast. You can read this really nice tribute that they did Ryan Stacy put that together on the Coast to Coast website, coasttocoastam.com. Just a little nod to a guy who had been kind enough to share his story and open himself up to a great amount of ridicule, but told it beautifully, always. And you can go listen to that, too, if you've got Coast Insider. Just click on to more, follow that at coasttocoastam.com. If you're looking for the photo, it's above the fold, as we would say in journalism, if I were to make a joke. And he was that kind of guy where he would have enjoyed that joke. And he had a sense of humor about where he was in life in whatever form Jason the Horse has passed. So, Deanne Stillman, thank you again for giving us this time. The book is all about the relationship between Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother, American Confidential. And it is a bizarre story, this kind of symbiosis between Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. And it doesn't get a lot of publicity. I remember at one point thinking, well, just sort of a natural assumption, that Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, she must have been so embarrassed by the actions of her son, and she must have gone into hiding virtually afterward, and so afraid that she was that, that reporters were going to hound her, and that she didn't want the limelight. She'd put her hand up in front of cameras. I just made all these assumptions, and then I went reading about it, and it was exactly the opposite.
Right.
Which should tell us a lot about Marguerite Oswald, but why don't you talk about what happened, like starting the day of the accusation of Lee Harvey Oswald?
Okay, let me just backtrack for 1 sec. When Lee Harvey Oswald got back from Russia, he found out, his mother told him that she was writing a book about his defection, and he was like, "Wait a second, I wrote my own book, and I'm trying to get it published myself." So they were like dueling mother and son with 2 book projects. And I guess he talked her out of trying to do anything with hers, and he went ahead and tried to have his own manuscript typed up, but nothing ever happened with it. At any rate, so she was trying to, attract attention to herself about her son's defection before he was killed. Not that she didn't have a right to tell her story, but, I mean, these are people who she herself was not a big reader, I mean, it's not like she always wanted to be a writer. At any rate, so after Lee was killed, she really sought the limelight. She did go ahead and write another book called Aftermath of an Execution, a booklet actually, which she started selling at Dealey Plaza along with other memorabilia about Lee. She would sell like photos of him with her autograph.
Yeah.
She, I think she ended up selling, or she included some letters that he had written to her from Russia in this book, Aftermath of an Execution. But she really sought fame and recognition herself, and she courted reporters. I mean, even before Lee was killed and after JFK was assassinated, she contacted, one of the first things she did was contact Bob Schieffer, a reporter at CBS. He was stationed in Dallas at the time, and she called up and said, I need a ride to the jailhouse.
Right.
And he was like, who's this? And she said, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And, so it was kind of like the scoop of the century. So he went and picked her up and drove her there. And he's often talked about how bizarre that was and how much the whole encounter was all about Marguerite. It just, was just kind of like her show, the Marguerite Oswald show. And a lot of other reporters have said that.
Yeah, she wanted a payday for every time she spoke. And when we talk about selling off Lee Harvey Oswald memorabilia or selling photos of Lee Harvey Oswald with her signature on there, that would be pretty much whenever she would run out of money. She would go down to Dealey Plaza and just hawk her wares, go up and down the sidewalk until she could get enough money that she could, get by for a while. But she wasn't.
Yeah.
She really wasn't interested in any long-term thing, and she certainly wasn't interested in contributing to history. And this pamphlet is like so lame. It's funny about the Bob Schieffer story that may be the last time she ever talked to a reporter without getting a check first.
Well, yeah, that's true. There might have been a couple of people here and there, but she generally she would often ask for payment in advance of interviews, but nobody, that most reporters did. She was, of course, besieged by reporters,
right?
From legitimate publications, and most of, these weren't people who would fork over cash for an interview.
Right. Well, they didn't have it to give. It wasn't. So, and then, what was she? I don't know if you know this. I was trying to find it. What typically she would ask for. I was assuming she was going to prorate that, from like a local reporter to a national story or something like that. But I couldn't find even a number. But I just know that everybody said the same thing, that she wanted money. And that
everybody said that, and she, there was a woman named Jean Stafford, a very good writer, who wrote a book called A Mother in History, who went to see her a number of months after Lee was killed, and she was originally on assignment for, I think it was for McCall's magazine, and then it became her book, A Mother in History. But she said that when, this was like in 1964 or something, and she said that when she went to Marguerite's house, Marguerite pointed out a new Buick Skylark, I think it was, in the driveway, and said, "See, that's Esquire money." So, who knows if that was
really
true or not? But there was like a new car in the driveway.
And this is her psychology, is that, okay, Lee Harvey Oswald, her son did this horrible thing, but she never. I don't know of a time. Maybe you could tell me. I don't know of a time when she didn't continue to defend Lee Harvey Oswald as being just following a previous pattern, as sort of this helicopter mom, that she was always defending him as being a victim, and that he was the victim of a conspiracy to kill him, and that he was completely innocent.
That's right. She just continued her pattern of, from whether it was Lee's, truancy at school, or, getting in trouble on the playground, or even like roughing up a neighbor's toddler whom he was babysitting. My son can do no wrong. So that was her presentation, in spades after JFK was killed. And she never once. I haven't come across anything in all my years of, looking into research and so on. She never once expressed remorse for the death of JFK.
No.
She would say things like, well, my son should be buried at Arlington too, because he did the country a favor. JFK had Addison's disease, and he put him out of his misery. And things like that. She never even stopped to express remorse, regardless of saying, she didn't have to say my son didn't do it. She could have just said, "Oh, this is a terrible thing," but she didn't appear to have been upset by it.
And I think in doing so too, she went out of her way to interact with the press. So just saying,
right.
"I'm so sorry it happened," and then kind of closing the doors on that chapter of her life and moving on, there was no money in that. And
that's right. She really tried to cash in on it, and I get that she, because she had this series of menial jobs throughout her life, that she didn't have any money, even then, after Ruby had killed Oswald.
Right.
so the only thing the only thing that she could sell was her son's notoriety and her own, kind of by proxy. And she did try to do that.
And his shirts and like anything she had, pre-Etsy, pre-internet, she would still find a way to sell articles of clothing that had nothing to do with the JFK assassination. It was just for the ghouls.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, very macabre. And she, I have a picture of her in my book standing in front of her library in her house, which is filled with all the books about Oswald at that time. And, of course, there were many even then. And, who can blame a mom for acquiring those? But she's standing, the picture is of her kind of standing. She's proud. She looks kind of proud of it. She's not remorseful. I mean, once again, it's not like, oh, this terrible thing happened and my son's associated with it. It's like,
my son, the assassin. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is anybody who's a parent, anybody who's spent any time raising children, no matter what you are, but anytime that's been around children to a degree, would feel slightly invested in their successes and their failures. And the fact that she didn't see this as a failure, or she treated it just as much as a success as if he had won an Oscar.
I think it was more like that.
Well, that's what I mean. Is like, to me, there's no difference. She treats his assassination of JFK no different than if Lee Harvey Oswald had won an Academy Award.
Yes, right. Because he had become important at that point. He was important, and that importance, extended to her. They became. It was just like he always planned, in my view. Are you talking to me, Ma? Look, Ma, look what I did.
And I think this fame thing that you're talking about, this where it's like he was trying to one up her desire for fame, and that she was always encouraging him to become increasingly more famous. In a way, his point is proven. I could shoot the president of the United States, and if that's what it took to become famous, that would be okay with Mom, which is so twisted, right, in its own way. And yet when I see portrayals of Marguerite Oswald on television, I think she comes off as kind of cranky or domineering or intrusive. She wasn't. She was every bit, it seems like, whatever the sociopathic tendency that Lee Harvey Oswald had, or that he weaponized by becoming a sociopathic narcissist, that whatever it was that he had, she was the one that gave it to him.
He was the one that I didn't hear what you said, Ian.
That she was the one who infected him eventually with this, as to make your point. That whatever he had, and I didn't quite realize it, that whatever it was that he had as a narcissist, narcissists are, there's a million narcissists out there, and she was clearly a narcissist. She just hadn't weaponized it in the way that Lee Harvey Oswald did, where he became a narcissist sociopath.
That's right.
And that's the difference. But it starts with her.
Oh, it all starts with her, for sure.
Yeah. So what about her relationship with...
back to this thing where they were both writing books when he got back from Russia.
Right.
I mean, they're both... It was like dueling publishing deals.
Right.
They were seeking. Wasn't like, oh, welcome back, I missed you. It was like, hey, I've been working on this book.
Right. And he was probably, at that point, he was used to whatever it was that he brought to her. It was going to get complicated and weird, including Marina. So here he has his Russian wife with him, and from the get, Marguerite doesn't like her.
No, I think, Marina was, any woman that Oswald would have married was, would have been competition. But here was a beautiful woman who didn't speak English and therefore was difficult to communicate with. So, there was a lot of resentment there. Marguerite, in all fairness, Marguerite did try to learn Russian and was taking Russian lessons for a while. But Lee and Marina felt that Marguerite was such a toxic person that they didn't even, when Marina had their first child, the first child, they didn't want Marguerite around the baby at all.
They forbade her from coming around the house because they didn't want this same thing to happen to their child that perhaps Lee Harvey Oswald knew had already happened to him. Yeah, so again, we're talking about the American Confidential uncovering the bizarre story of Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. We'll get to your questions and comments coming up in just a second. Deanne Stillman is the author. But, man, there is so much more to this. And this interplay between Lee Harvey Oswald and his mom, where his own defects, his own personality defects, not only seem to come directly from his mother, but also his desire to try to prove himself, to become famous as an addict toward everybody paying attention to him, leading up to the assassination of JFK. That is a slightly different angle than most people think about when they think about Lee Harvey Oswald. We'll get to all of this next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett.